now it's the discussion time for both your talk and the one of Jana. I see there is already a question. I'll just see that. By Naomi Rockotnitz. Please ask your question. We have about 15, 20 minutes.
Hi. Thank you so much. I've enjoyed all 4 papers tremendously. And thank you particularly, Hannah, for the final paper, because I was going to ask about complexity and then you brought out all the terrifying complexities of empathy. So my question really to everyone is a double question. One is, it seems so far from your talks that you equate what has been termed by some of you aesthetic emotions and real life emotions. So the assumption is that whatever empathy and emotions are aroused through the literary text are the same or have similar effects in real life. And yet, as Hannah's paper just exemplified, perhaps the literature allows us to identify or immerse ourselves in the complexities of empathy, but then doesn't necessarily translate into being more empathetic in real life. So my question is, also relating to the research that was presented earlier, is there any evidence that the emotions, and particularly empathy and sympathy, which aren't always identical, the empathy and sympathy that are created by reading and identifying and immersing in literature, having any effects in people's lives outside their literary experience?
There's a lot there. Jana, do you want to say anything? There?
I can try to ask the last question. There are many empirical studies try to identify a relationship between reading narratives, having specific kind of emotions, and looking whether that improves or changes the ability for cognitive as well as emotional empathy. There are enormous studies showing positive evidence for that relationship. There are also other studies showing that they could not replicate the results. So at the end, most of the studies are correlational studies. So we see there is an effect, but there's still the open question, what may be the processes beyond that effect, and maybe also the direction to the effect. So when we invite, for example, persons coming into the lab and read a narrative or something like that, they always have different levels of empathic abilities, and newest study indicates that you need a specific amount of empathy so that you can really learn from reading a narrative and feeling some kind of emotion during reading. So there are positive evidences, to make it short, but we are far away from understanding what are really the processes beyond that relationship.
Yeah, I guess to that I would add that Suzanne Keene wrote a whole book on this, at least a big chunk of it, arguing that we can't assume that we change as a result of reading books, or that it induces pro-social behavior. I would like to believe that it does sometimes, but I don't know. I think that's a big question that people love to debate. And as for whether the emotions of literature are different from those of real life, I mean, Vittorio and I wrote about this. Literary emotions are being scaffolded on the same system. But what's missing in literature, what's not happening, is that immediate face-to-face contact we might feel with the person standing in front of us. Instead, we're being pushed around by a text, whatever form it comes in, and given directions. And so in this talk today, I'm talking about how our emotions are being channeled through conflict and tested through the conflict in really interesting ways. So yeah, that's what I meant by the differential element, that we will bestow empathy only in relation to some kind of conflict. So there's a kind of reasoned element here that slows it down and that may change change the effect that we might have in real life. But I think there are other people in the conversation here, or the room, who have a lot of ideas about this. So jump in, folks. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much for both question and answers. Next question by Grazia, I think. Please. Grazia Pulvirenti.
Hi, thank you for both very inspiring talks. I would like to ask Jana if you could elucidate any specific stylistic or rhetoric or linguistic quality associated with the liking issue and the report of finding the text particularly aesthetically involving and emotionally involving.
So when I just have a look on the data I presented, I have some relatively general ratings about cognitive as well as emotional empathy, and also about style. So just in generally evaluation or answer to the question whether attention was spent to specific stylistic devices in poems. An answer to that question, for example, is not related to the liking, which was a little bit unexpected for me, because in other studies we saw a relationship between attention to stylistic devices and aesthetic appreciation. Maybe that has something to do also with the persons we use as participants in our research. We used not well-trained persons, but maybe lay persons, and I assume that they recognize some, but not all stylistic devices in the poems.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was a question by Vittorio. Yes, Vittorio, the next one, please.
Yeah, a comment more than a question, as I was pulled out by Hannah's invitation to jump in. I mean, I enormously enjoyed both talks, and I think both talks contributed to speak of the complexity of empathy. So my first comment is the following: empathy is complex, not only in literature, it is complex in life as well. The second comment would be that I don't see a necessary relationship between empathy as being displayed in real life, or as being derived from the reading of novels of fiction and prosocial behavior. This is a common misunderstanding, equating empathy, feeling with sympathy, feeling for. I think that you need to be empathetic in order to be sympathetic, prosocial, ready to help others. But the opposite doesn't necessarily apply, which means that you can be empathetic without being sympathetic, or worse, you can use your empathy to manipulate others or to do harm to others. The third comment deals with one of the biggest complex topics that we all are dealing with, in particular neuroscience, and the topic of emotion. It's men at work all over the place. First, because we do not have a common agreed upon definition of what emotions are, whether basic emotion exists, how many there are, whether they are really universal or not. So the pendulum, which keeps shifting from innatism to constructivism, even in the domain of emotion now, is witnessing a burst of constructivism, even from people in my field, holding that emotions are socially constructed, they are not universal, and the like. But leaving this hot debate aside, I never truly understood why it is possible or legitimate to draw a sharp distinction between aesthetic emotion, often qualified as quasi-emotion, and genuine emotion. I think, at least from the vantage point of the brain body, this is a big mistake. At the end of this webinar, of this first day of the webinar, I'll bicycle to the local opera house to see a staging of Verdi's Trovatore. And if the staging will be good, which I hope for, in some topic moments, I will foresee that I will be generally moved and even moved to tears, perhaps, if the singers are great and the conductor as well. So are these quasi-tears? When I weep for the fate of poor Traviata at the end of another Verdi masterpiece, and most of the time I can tell you by the watch when I'll start weeping, if the performance is good as well. Poor performance would elicit other genuine emotion, negative emotion of a different quality. Those tears are quasi-tears, they are genuine. So, because the brain is just one, the eliciting condition to evoke all these complex mechanisms can differ, but the outcome, in my opinion, is the same. Sorry.
Thank you, Vittorio. I think we have to there is another notification by Johanna Hartmann. Please, Johanna.
Yes, thank you. My question goes to Hannah, and there were a couple of words or concepts that stuck out during your presentation: the lightning rod, so the element of chance, but then also when you talked about Jesus, you mentioned crisis, or in your last example, the notion of destiny. And I would like you to talk about crisis, which, from an etymological point of view, means decision, right? So there has to be a sort of decision process at play in order to decide, well, is it really a decision whether group dynamics are acted out or not, whether somebody is to be blamed or not. And I would like you to talk about this process when seemingly a process is set in place that is really hard to stop by individuals or the group. So can you maybe talk a bit more about how these texts that you've looked at deal with this transitional phase between, yes, there is an outsider, there is a conflict, but when does the violence start? When is somebody being scapegoated?
Thanks, Joanna. That's a good question. So I guess I'll focus on the novel I was talking about, Chronicle of a Death Foretold, because one reading of the book is that there's no way to stop the killing. It's fated. And many of the people in town see it as fate, that, you know, it's sort of destiny that Santiago doesn't get home in time to see the note under the door, or his friend can't help him. It's not that nobody's trying. So on the one hand, there's this sort of fate narrative in the story. And on the other, there's a set of conscious decisions by some people not to take their actions further or do more of an intervention. And I'd say the book doesn't really totally settle that. You know, the kind of dynamic, or the question of, you know, what weight do we give to fate in the story, in the death, and what weight do we give to people's choices is not really settled. So you're right to point it out that there's a kind of level of fate acting there, but I'm not sure that totally gets at your full question, does it? Is there anything else you want to tack on there?
Maybe the question is also, quite general. So thank you so much, Hannah.
Okay, we'll talk
thank you
later.
very much. Thank you. There is a very last question by Nabi, who is back, please. Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you for allowing me to speak again.
No, you're much welcome.
Hi, yes. I want to refer back because it brings us back to the beginning of the discussion very interestingly. So I'm very invested in these questions because I'm in literature and philosophy, and I know how complex it is. I'm slightly playing devil's advocate here, but I'm really interested in what you have to say, because well, not clearly, but most of us, I imagine, would agree that any aesthetic emotions are not quasi-emotions. Right, they're real emotions. We feel them in an embodied sense, in a cognitive sense, all the senses you've been talking about. And yet, as Hannah's paper brought out, often we compartmentalize them so that you can have, we know from history, across cultures, across languages, across religions, people have read poetry, listened to music, gone to the theatre, and had very, very cultured, rich experiences of empathy or aesthetic emotions, and yet committed atrocities. So the question that I'm wondering whether, but Garcia can't answer it, so probably we can't either, is whether the extent of the immersion, the amount of reading we do, or exposure to emotions, or identification with other people, or all these things which we imagine would possibly make us better people, clearly don't stop us from committing atrocities. So what's, at the end of the day, the use of it outside the bubble of aesthetic experience?
I don't know.
Okay.
I was thinking about this last night. Like, what's the answer? René Girard came up with a religious answer, but that doesn't satisfy a lot of people. Yeah, if there were an easy answer, we'd be doing it, right? But again, I invite anybody and everybody to jump in, because that's the real question. There's Suzanne.
Thank you. And now a question by Susan Keane. Please, Susan.
Hi, I hope that I'm audible.
It's okay,
Yep.
of course.
Okay, very good. I don't want to answer the question. I think these questions are so great and virtually perennial, but I want to say it's great to hear the questions being raised again and again, because there's I think a danger in imagining that what we're chasing is some sort of panacea via aesthetic experience for the things that are wrong in the world. And religious or not, all you have to do is look at the history of world religion to know that the narrative efforts and persuasive efforts of those organizations over the millennia have often employed story and the emotional affordances of story in order to try to enjoin people to stop being so terrible to one another, with, one might just say, mixed results. So to put the burden on arts, on I'm particularly concerned with literary reading, but on any of the arts, to sort of cure what ails us as humans, I think we shouldn't be trying to do that, but that all the questions about what's the status of the emotion that we feel when we're engaging with art objects, including narratives, and how those things might affect our behavior are really important and real questions, but ones that, from my point of view, we always have to turn back to the science that tells us that people are really different from one another, and that there are people whose baseline temperament would make them particularly not very interested in any of the aesthetic engagement that we're talking about, and that all of the strategies of those art objects would be unlikely to create any kind of result in those people, simply because they're already not interested. They're not interested enough that they would not be moved by the strategies of the art objects. And that there's probably people, and I think probably everybody in this room is one of those people, who is prone to be especially moved by things. You know, you go to the opera and you expect to cry, you probably will. But that we should really be very careful to avoid generalizations that are not supported by empirical evidence or by historical evidence. That's just my hunch as to how we ought to proceed, with some caution, but with great interest. And thanks to all the writers for the wonderful papers that we've heard this morning. Thank you.